The stars above Illyra Station used to be a comfort. For as long as Commander Seldara Voth could remember, she had looked up at them from the observation deck and felt small in a good way, the way a child feels small next to a parent. Tonight the stars looked different. Tonight they looked like a crowd of silent witnesses, watching to see if her people would survive until morning. Seldara stood on the bridge of the Starhome's Hope, the flagship of what remained of the Valen Third Fleet. Her hands were folded behind her back, but her claws were digging into her own skin hard enough to hurt. She did not let it show on her face. A commander who showed fear gave her crew permission to feel it too, and right now, fear was the one thing they could not afford. On the main screen, red markers filled the black. 41 ships. 41 Croth warships, arranged in a slow, patient wall, crawling toward Illyra Station like a predator that already knew its prey could not run. The Valen had 11 ships left, 11, against 41. Report, Seldara said. Her tactical officer, a younger Valen named Doran Is, did not look up from his console. They've stopped accelerating, Commander. They're not in a hurry. Estimated time to weapons range is 6 hours. 6 hours. 6 hours to save 400,000 lives on the surface below. And 11 ships to do it with. The Valen were not a warrior people. They had never needed to be. Their homeworld and colonies sat in a quiet corner of the galaxy, far from the old empires and their old wars. And for 300 years they had built farms and cities and universities instead of armies. Illyra Station itself was proof of that. It was not a fortress. It was a trading post, a place where grain ships from the surface met merchant vessels from a dozen friendly worlds, its long docking arms shaped like open hands rather than closed fists. The Croth Empire did not care about any of that. The Croth did not conquer worlds to rule them. They came to strip them. Every world the Croth had ever taken lost its people to slaveholds and its resources to their forges, and what was left behind was silence. Commander, said Ambassador Rel Tavan, stepping onto the bridge with the careful, controlled walk of someone forcing themselves not to run. Rel was not military. He had spent his life negotiating trade agreements and water rights between neighboring colonies, a job that had never once required him to consider the deaths of children. His face now looked like a man aging in real time. Have we heard back from anyone? Seldara's jaw tightened. Not yet. It's been 4 hours since we sent the call. I know how long it has been, Ambassador. She did know. She had counted every minute. 6 hours ago, when the Croth fleet first appeared at the edge of the system, Seldara had ordered every distress channel opened at once. A call like that cost nothing to send and, in her experience, usually brought nothing back. But protocol was protocol, and hope, even a thin thread of it, was still hope. The first response came from the Threllan Assembly, the closest allied government, 3 jumps away. Their reply took almost 2 hours to arrive, translated through layers of diplomatic language that could not hide its meaning. We sympathize with your situation. However, committing our fleet to a conflict outside assembly space risks provoking a wider war we are not prepared to fight. We wish you strength. We wish you strength. As if strength were something you could simply wish into existence. The second response came from the Korvath Trade Union, whose merchant fleets used Illyra Station more than any other outpost in the region. Their reply was shorter. Our vessels are unarmed transport craft. We have no combat ships to send. We recommend evacuation. Evacuation? To where? There were no ships to evacuate 400,000 people, and even if there were, there was nowhere near enough time. The third call went to the Iveth Concord, a distant power with a fleet large enough to crush the Croth attackers without effort. The Iveth had signed a mutual defense treaty with the Valen 2 decades ago, back when such treaties were fashionable among smaller powers hoping to look important on the galactic stage. That treaty had never been tested. It was not tested today either. The Iveth response, when it finally came, cited logistical constraints and the need for full council approval, a process that would take, at minimum, 3 weeks. Illyra Station did not have 3 weeks. It had 6 hours, and now, closer to 5.5. There's one channel left, Doran said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over the bridge. The old emergency beacon frequency, the one that broadcasts into the fringe. Several officers turned to look at him. The Fringe was the name given to the vast, unmapped stretch of space beyond the known trade routes, a region no major power had ever bothered to survey properly. Rumors said a species lived out there, isolated and primitive, barely capable of leaving their own solar system. No one had ever made real contact with them. No one had ever needed to. "That's a waste of a transmission," said another officer, an older woman named Ket Sariel, who had served on the Hope longer than anyone aboard. "There's nothing out there but empty space and old stories." "There's nothing out there," Rel said slowly, "but we've asked everyone who is somewhere, and they've all said no." Seldara looked at the tactical display again. The red markers had not slowed. 41 Kroth ships, closing steadily on 11 Valen ships, and a station full of families who had no idea, yet, how close they were to losing everything. She thought of her own daughter, down on the surface, probably asleep in her bed at this very moment, trusting that the adults of the world would keep her safe. Seldara had made that same promise to herself 1,000 times since taking command. She intended to keep it, even if keeping it meant grasping at threads no reasonable commander would bother with. "Send it," she said. "Send it on every frequency we have, into the Fringe, into empty space, into anywhere a signal can travel. I don't care how unlikely it is. I want it sent." Doran's hands moved over his console. "Transmitting now, Commander. Full spectrum broadcast, all directions beyond the Fringe boundary." On the screen, a thin blue line appeared, spreading out from Alira Station in every direction, racing outward at the speed of light, into darkness that had never answered anyone. It looked, Seldara thought, exactly as small and as hopeless as it was. A whisper thrown into a canyon, with no walls to send back an echo. "Signal sent," Doran confirmed. "No acknowledgement protocols in that region. We won't know if it was even received." "Understood," Seldara said. She turned back to the main display, back to the slow red wall drifting closer with every passing second. "Recall all civilian shuttles to the station. Begin loading evacuation pods. We buy as much time as we can, for as many people as we can." The bridge crew moved into motion, voices low and steady, professionals doing their jobs even as the numbers on every screen told them exactly how this would likely end. Seldara stayed where she was, staring at that thin blue line, as it faded from the display, already light years away, carrying a message that might never reach a living soul. She did not believe help was coming. She had learned, over the last 6 hours, that help rarely came when it was needed most. Governments weighed risk against reward. Alliances protected themselves first. That was the shape of the galaxy she had grown up in, and nothing about tonight had changed her mind about it. But she had sent the signal anyway, because the alternative was to send nothing, and there was still a small, stubborn part of her, buried under all the years of careful diplomacy and cautious calculation, that refused to give up before the fight was over. 5.5 hours remained. Seldara straightened her shoulders, looked at her crew, and began giving the orders that might, if nothing else, buy her people a little more time to say goodbye. Behind her, unseen and unheard, that thin blue line of light kept traveling outward into the dark, past the edge of known space, past the boundary the Valen called the Fringe, into territory no Valen ship had ever charted. It would take 3 more hours to reach anything at all. And on the other end of that silence, something was about to listen. Down on the surface of Alira's home planet, a world the Valen called Vertha, the evening market in the capital city was still open, when the first evacuation order reached the streets. Merchants were folding away bolts of woven cloth. Children were chasing each other between fruit stalls, their laughter echoing off buildings made of pale stone that had stood for over a century. None of them knew yet that 41 warships were crawling toward their sky. The city's public speakers had been silent on the matter for hours, on Seldara's own orders, because panic before an evacuation plan was ready would kill more people than the Kroth fleet ever could. That silence broke at last, with a calm, practiced voice that came from every speaker in the city at once. "This is Vertha Civil Defense. All residents are asked to proceed calmly to designated shelter zones. This is not a drill." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, all at once, everybody did. Seldara watched it happen through a dozen camera feeds relayed up to the Star Home's Hope, standing at the edge of the bridge, where she could see both the tactical display and the surface footage at the same time. Streets that had been full of ordinary evening business turned, within minutes, into rivers of people moving toward the shelters, built into the hills outside the city. Parents carried children. Neighbors helped elders, who could not move fast enough on their own. It was, in its own terrible way, one of the most orderly things Seldara had ever seen her people do, and it broke her heart to watch it. "Shelters can hold 60% of the population," Rel said quietly, standing beside her. He had stopped trying to sound calm an hour ago. "The rest will have to rely on basements, storm cellars, anything with reinforced walls." 60%, Seldara repeated. "And the Croth boarding parties will go through basements and storm cellars like they go through everything else." Neither of them said what they both knew. Shelters would slow the Croth down. They would not stop them. The Croth Empire did not bomb worlds from orbit, not when there were people down there worth taking. They landed, they broke down doors, and they marched away with entire families in chains, destined for forges and mines, on worlds so far away that no one ever heard from them again. Doran's voice cut through the quiet. "Commander, Croth fleet has entered the outer system. Time to weapons range. 4 hours, 10 minutes. 4 hours. It had felt like 6 hours would never end, and now 4 felt impossibly short. Seldara turned from the surface feeds and looked instead at her own ships, arranged in a defensive line between the station and the incoming enemy fleet. 11 vessels. The Starhome's Hope, her flagship, was the largest of them, built for long-distance trade escort rather than sustained combat. The others were smaller, faster, better suited to chasing off pirates than facing a real invasion force. None of them had been built for a fight like this. None of them had ever needed to be. She thought about the officers and crew serving under her, most of them younger than she was, many of them barely out of the academy. Doran had joined the fleet 4 years ago because he loved star charts and wanted to see new systems, not because he ever expected to fight a war. Quetzariel had 2 grown children of her own on the surface right now, walking toward a shelter with everyone else, and she had not said a single word about it since the order went out, because saying it out loud would mean admitting how frightened she was. This was who they were. Farmers and traders and mapmakers, forced by circumstance into the shape of soldiers, standing between an enemy fleet and everything they loved, because there was no one else left to stand there. "Any response to the distress calls?" Seldara asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Nothing new from the Threllan Assembly or the Korvath Union," Doran said. "The Iveth Concord has confirmed receipt of our follow-up request. They're forwarding it to their council for review." "Review," Ket muttered from her station, not quite under her breath. "Our children will be in chains before their council finishes reviewing anything." Nobody corrected her. Nobody could. Seldara walked the length of the bridge slowly, forcing herself to look calm, even as the weight of every decision she had made in the last 6 hours pressed down harder with every step. She had chosen to fight rather than flee, because fleeing would mean abandoning the surface population entirely, and that was a line she would not cross. She had chosen to send the civilian evacuation before committing her fleet to battle positions, buying precious minutes at the cost of tactical advantage. She had chosen, an hour ago, to send a distress call into empty, unmapped space, on nothing but a rumor and a wish. She did not regret any of those choices. She simply wished she had more of them left to make. "Commander," Doran said, and something in his voice made her stop walking. "I'm picking up something odd on the emergency frequency, the one we used for the Fringe broadcast." Seldara turned toward him immediately. "Define odd." "A response," Doran said, sounding almost afraid to say the word out loud, as though saying it might make it untrue. "A short one. No message, just an acknowledgement ping, and a set of coordinates. It's requesting a course heading toward our position." The bridge went utterly silent. Every officer who could hear him had stopped what they were doing. "Show me," Seldara said. The data appeared on the main screen, a single, tiny burst of transmission, arriving from a direction so far beyond the edge of known space that the Hope's own systems had trouble classifying its point of origin. There was no accompanying message, No explanation, no identification beacon that matched anything in the Valen database. Just a ping, and a heading, and the unmistakable signature of something moving. Could it be Croth? Rel asked, his voice tight. A trick, drawing us out? The signal came from beyond the fringe boundary, Doran said. The Croth have never operated out there. As far as we know, nobody operates out there. Seldara stared at the screen, at that single point of light representing something, someone, responding to a call she had sent with no real hope of an answer. Old stories about the fringe came back to her, half-remembered rumors from her academy days about a strange, isolated species living somewhere beyond the mapped stars, a species most scholars dismissed as too primitive and too insular to matter to anyone. Whatever had answered her call was neither too far away nor too disinterested to respond. "Track it," she ordered. "I want constant updates on its position, its speed, anything you can tell me about what's coming toward us." "Understood," Doran said, already working. A few seconds passed before he spoke again, quieter this time. "Commander, based on its current trajectory and velocity, whatever this is, it's moving fast, faster than anything in our own fleet." "How fast?" Doran looked up from his console, and for the first time since the Croth fleet had appeared, there was something other than fear on his face. It was closer to confusion, mixed with a thin, cautious thread of something Seldara had almost forgotten how to feel. "At this speed," he said, "it will reach our position in under 3 hours, before the Croth fleet does." 3 hours ago, Seldara had sent a message into the dark, with no real expectation that anyone would ever hear it, let alone answer. 3 hours ago, she had told herself that the important thing was trying, not succeeding, because succeeding had seemed impossible. Now something was answering. Something was coming. She did not yet know if it was salvation, or simply another danger wearing an unfamiliar face. But for the first time since the Croth fleet appeared on her scopes, Seldara allowed herself the smallest, most cautious flicker of something she had almost forgotten the name of: hope. "All hands," she said, her voice carrying across the bridge, steady despite everything. "Whatever is coming, we will be ready for it. Maintain defensive formation. Continue evacuation efforts on the surface. And keep that signal tracked every second until we know exactly what is heading our way." Behind her, the tactical display showed 2 dots now instead of 1, the slow, patient wall of red that was the Croth fleet, and a single, fast-moving point of light, still too far away to identify, racing out of the unmapped dark toward a battle that was not its own. 3 hours remained until it arrived. 3 hours to find out whether the void had sent them a rescuer or simply a second enemy to face before the end. The single point of light grew larger on the tactical display with every passing minute, and with it grew the tension on the bridge of the Starhome's Hope. Seldara had ordered every sensor array on the ship turned toward the incoming contact, and still the results told her almost nothing useful. Whatever was approaching was small compared to the Croth capital ships, closer in size to one of her own escort vessels, yet it was moving at a speed that made no sense for something that size. Her own science officer, a quiet, careful Valen named Iona Prell, had spent the better part of an hour running the numbers 3 separate times, hoping for a different answer each time. "It's not slowing down," Iona finally reported, her voice carefully controlled. "If anything, it's still accelerating. Commander, at this rate, it will arrive in just under 2 hours." 2 hours, Rel repeated. "And the Croth fleet?" "Weapons range in 2 hours and 40 minutes, Doran said. "The contact will beat them here, whatever it is." 2 hours and 40 minutes. It was strange, Seldara thought, how a number that had once felt like an execution sentence now felt almost like breathing room, simply because something unknown was arriving first. "Ket," Seldara said, turning to her communications officer, "try hailing it again. Every frequency. I want to know who is flying that ship before it arrives, not after." Ket had been trying for the last hour with no success. She tried again now, opening every channel the Hope possessed, speaking slowly and clearly, in the standard trade language used across a dozen allied systems. "Unidentified vessel. This is the Valen ship, Starhome's Hope. We received your response to our distress signal. Please identify yourself and state your intentions." Silence answered her. the same silence that had answered every attempt before it. The unknown ship continued its approach, sending no message, offering no explanation, simply closing the distance with a steady, relentless certainty that Seldara found herself unable to decide was reassuring or unnerving. "Maybe it can't understand us," Doran offered. "If it truly comes from beyond the fringe, it may use a language none of our translation systems have ever encountered. Or, it understands us perfectly, and simply doesn't feel the need to answer," Ket said quietly. Seldara considered both possibilities, and found neither of them comforting. She thought back to the old academy lectures about the fringe, half-remembered fragments from a course she had taken decades ago on unexplored regions of the galaxy. The lecturer, an aging Valen scholar with more theories than evidence, had spoken of a species rumored to exist somewhere out there, calling them by a name that sounded strange even now, all these years later. Humans, a species said to be isolated, technologically limited, confined mostly to their own small solar system, of no real interest to the wider galactic community. If the rumors were true, nothing about a primitive, isolated species explained a ship capable of outrunning every vessel in the Valen fleet. "Commander," Iona said suddenly, her voice sharper than before. "I'm getting a clearer read on its hull now that it's closer. This isn't a small ship. It only reads small next to the Kroth capital ships. Compared to our own vessels, it's roughly the size of a heavy cruiser." "A heavy cruiser moving at that speed," Doran murmured, half to himself. "What kind of engine does that?" Nobody had an answer. On the surface below, the last waves of evacuation had reached the shelters. Seldara had watched the final camera feeds with a tight chest, counting families as they disappeared into the reinforced hillside bunkers, knowing that even now, thousands would be left in whatever shelter they could find on their own. She forced her attention back to the bridge, back to the only thing she could still control. "All ships, maintain defensive formation," she ordered over the fleet-wide channel. "If this contact proves hostile, I want a firing solution ready the moment it arrives. If it proves otherwise," she paused, unsure, for the first time in hours, exactly how to finish that sentence. "If it proves otherwise, we will know soon enough." The minutes crawled by. Seldara found herself watching the small dot on the display the way one might watch a held breath, waiting for it to either become something worth exhaling over or something that demanded every remaining ounce of fight left in her tired fleet. 1 hour to arrival, Doran reported. Kroth fleet now at 90 minutes to weapons range. The unknown ship would arrive first, a full 30 minutes before the enemy. 30 minutes in which the Valen fleet would stand alongside, or against, something they knew almost nothing about. Ket tried the hail again, and again received nothing but silence in return. She tried a third time, when the ship crossed the outer sensor boundary, then a fourth, as it entered a range close enough that visual contact would soon be possible. Each attempt met the same wall of quiet, until, without warning, on the 5th attempt, something changed. The console in front of Ket lit up with a new signal, not a spoken reply, but a data burst, arriving in a format the Hope systems had never seen before. Iona worked quickly to decode it, her fingers moving fast across her console, her earlier caution replaced by focused urgency. It's some kind of identification code," Iona said. "A ship designation, I think. The translation software is struggling, but I'm getting fragments. Something like Valkyrie, UES Valkyrie's Wrath." "A name," Rel said quietly. "It gave us a name." "It's not an alliance code we recognize," Doran added, "but it's formatted like a military designation. Whoever built that ship, they organized their fleets the way we do." Seldara stared at the fragmented data on the screen, the first real piece of information about the vessel racing toward them, still refusing to answer a single spoken hail, despite clearly having the capability to communicate. A name, offered without explanation, without context, without any indication of whether the ship behind it came as friend, mercenary, or something else entirely. "Keep trying to raise them directly," she said. "I want a voice, not just a code." Ket nodded and tried again, her voice steady despite the tension visible in her shoulders. "UES Valkyrie's Wrath. This is Commander Seldara Voth of the Valen ship Starhome's Hope. We see your approach. We ask again, please state your intentions." More silence followed. long enough that Seldara began to wonder if the ship intended to answer at all, or if the identification code was the only communication they would ever receive from it. Then, 30 minutes before the unknown ship was due to arrive, the silence finally broke. A voice came through the speakers, calm, measured, and entirely unfamiliar in tone and accent, speaking words the Hope's translation system scrambled to process in real time, the meaning arriving a half-second behind the sound itself, close enough to understand. Starhome's Hope, this is Captain Marcus Reyes, commanding the UES Valkyrie's Wrath. We received your distress call. Apologies for the silence. We were confirming your situation before responding. Current assessment: 41 hostile vessels, 11 friendly vessels, civilian population at risk. Is that correct? Seldara felt something tighten in her chest, a strange mixture of relief and disbelief so strong it nearly stole her voice. She forced herself to answer, steady and clear, the way a commander should. That is correct, Captain. We did not expect an answer to our call. We certainly did not expect it to arrive before the enemy did. There was a brief pause on the other end, and when the voice returned, there was something in it Seldara could not quite place. Something that sounded almost like grim amusement, mixed with something far colder underneath. You called for help, Captain Reyes said. Help is what we do. We'll be there in 30 minutes. Recommend you hold formation and stay out of our firing lanes once we arrive. This is going to get loud. The channel closed before Seldara could ask what, exactly, one ship intended to do against 41. On the tactical display, the small dot that was the UES Valkyrie's Wrath continued its approach, steady and unwavering, closing the distance toward a battle that, by every reasonable measure, it had no chance of surviving. Seldara turned to her bridge crew, all of them staring at the display with the same mixture of hope and disbelief that had settled over her own chest, and found herself saying the only thing that felt true in that moment. Whoever they are, she said quietly, let's hope they're as confident as they sound. 30 minutes remained until the void delivered its answer in full. The last 30 minutes passed slower than any of the hours before them. Seldara stood at the center of the bridge, watching the tactical display with an intensity that made her eyes ache. The small dot representing the UES Valkyrie's Wrath continued its approach, steady and unwavering, while behind it, still distant but growing closer with every passing second, the wall of red that was the Croth fleet pressed forward, with the same patient certainty it had shown since the beginning. 10 minutes to arrival, Doran said, his voice tight with an anticipation he was clearly trying to control. Visual contact should be possible soon. Seldara nodded and said nothing, saving her focus for the moment the unknown vessel would finally reveal itself. She had spent 3 hours imagining what kind of ship could move faster than her own fleet and answer a call for help with such calm, unhurried confidence. None of the images in her mind had prepared her for what actually appeared on the main screen when the Hope's long-range optical sensors finally locked on. The ship was unlike anything she had ever seen. Valen vessels were built with soft, curved lines, hulls shaped for efficiency and grace, designed by engineers who thought first about comfort and only second about survivability. The UES Valkyrie's Wrath looked like it had been designed by someone who had never once considered comfort at all. Its hull was long and angular, plated in dark gray armor that seemed to swallow the starlight around it rather than reflect it. Weapon emplacements lined its surface in numbers that seemed almost excessive for a ship its size, clustered along a spine that curved slightly, like a blade. There was nothing soft about it. Nothing about its shape suggested trade, or diplomacy, or anything other than a singular purpose. That's a warship, Ket said quietly, echoing the thought running through every mind on the bridge. Built for nothing but fighting. It's alone, Iona added, almost disbelieving. One ship, it's really just one ship. Seldara stared at the image, feeling a strange, cold weight settle into her stomach. She had allowed herself a small measure of hope over the last 30 minutes, hope that had grown with every steady, confident word from the ship's captain. Seeing the vessel itself, small against the void, utterly alone against an approaching wall of 41 enemy warships, that hope now felt fragile in a way it hadn't before. Captain Reyes, Seldara said, opening a direct channel, unable to keep a note of concern from her voice. You're alone. Where is the rest of your fleet? The reply came a moment later, calm as it had been before, edged with something that might have been the beginning of a smile, though Seldara had no way to know what a human smile even sounded like through a voice channel. "There is no rest of the fleet, Commander, just us. One ship against 41, Seldara said slowly. "Captain, I don't know how your people measure the odds of a battle, but by any measure I understand. This is not a fight you can win alone." "You're right," Reyes said, and there was no hesitation in his voice at all. No fear. Nothing that resembled the caution Seldara would have expected from anyone facing such numbers. "It's not a fight I can win alone. It's a fight I can start alone. Buy your civilians time, hurt them badly enough that hitting your fleet stops looking easy, and keep them occupied until reinforcements decide the math isn't worth it anymore." "Reinforcements?" Seldara asked immediately, seizing on the word. "You have reinforcements coming?" There was a brief pause before Reyes answered, and in that pause, Seldara thought she heard something almost like careful honesty being weighed against comforting reassurance. "That's still being determined, Commander. What I can promise you is that the Croth are not fighting one ship today. They're fighting whatever it takes." The channel went quiet, and on the tactical display, the Valkyrie's Wrath continued its approach, closing the last remaining distance between itself and the Valen defensive line. "Commander," Doran said, "the Croth fleet has noticed the new contact. They're adjusting course slightly, but they're not slowing down. I don't think they view a single ship as a serious threat." "They will," Rel murmured, standing near the back of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the screen with an expression that mixed dread and something almost like awe. "Or they'll be right, and we'll watch that ship die in the first exchange." Seldara didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on the display, watching as the Valkyrie's Wrath slid into position at the front of the Valen formation, not behind the defensive line where a smaller, more cautious commander might have placed a single reinforcement, but directly in front of it, closest to the approaching enemy fleet, standing between the Croth and everyone else, like a wall made of one ship. "They're taking point," Iona said, disbelief clear in her voice. "They're putting themselves between us and the entire enemy fleet." "All ships." Reyes's voice came again over the fleet-wide channel, addressed now to the entire Valen formation, rather than to Seldara alone. "This is Captain Reyes of the UES Valkyrie's Wrath. I know none of you know us. I know you have no reason to trust a ship that showed up out of nowhere with no fleet behind it. I'm not asking you to trust us. I'm asking you to hold your formation, protect your civilians, and let us do what we came here to do." Seldara found herself gripping the edge of her console, watching the single ship glide into position, weapons systems visibly powering up along its dark hull, energy signatures blooming across every sensor readout the Hope possessed. "Commander," Ket said, her voice hushed. "Their weapons power output is... Commander, I've never seen numbers like this, not from a ship that size." "Confirm the reading," Seldara said immediately. "Confirmed," Ket answered a moment later. "Whatever technology that ship is running on, it's generating more raw power than 3 of our own vessels combined." Seldara looked at the tactical display one more time, at the slow, confident approach of 41 Croth warships who had, until this moment, faced nothing but a fleet they knew they could crush without difficulty. She thought about the calm certainty in Captain Reyes's voice, the way he had spoken about buying time and hurting the enemy badly enough to change the math of the battle, as though such things were simple, ordinary tasks, rather than the desperate gambits of a single ship facing impossible odds. 15 minutes to weapons range, Doran reported, his voice steadier now, carrying a thread of something Seldara hadn't heard from him since the crisis began, something that sounded almost like anticipation. The Croth fleet continued its advance, unbothered, unhurried, still treating the entire engagement as a foregone conclusion. Seldara allowed herself, for the first time in hours, to wonder if that assumption might be wrong. "All Valen ships," she said, opening the fleet-wide channel, her voice carrying the same steady confidence she had spent the entire crisis trying to project, even when she didn't feel it. "Hold defensive formation, protect the station and the evacuation routes. Let the Valkyrie's Wrath lead the first engagement, and watch closely. Whatever happens next, I want every officer in this fleet to understand exactly what we're witnessing." On the display, the single human warship held its position at the head of the Valen formation, weapons fully charged, engines humming with contained power, facing down an armada 41 ships strong, with nothing behind it but empty space, and a fleet of strangers who had no idea what to expect. The Kroth fleet entered weapons range, and the Valkyrie's Wrath opened fire first. Die! The first shot from the UES Valkyrie's Wrath did not look like anything Seldara had ever seen a warship fire before. Valen weapons technology relied on focused energy beams, precise and clean, designed to disable rather than destroy whenever possible, a philosophy born from a species that had never truly needed to wage total war. What lanced out from the Valkyrie's Wrath was something else entirely. A single, blinding streak of light crossed the distance between the human ship and the lead Kroth vessel in less than a second, and where it struck, the enemy ship's forward shields didn't simply weaken. They failed completely, collapsing in a burst of light visible even from the Hope's bridge, and the weapon behind it tore straight through the Kroth hull, as though the armor plating were little more than decoration. "Direct hit," Doran said, staring at his console in open disbelief. "Commander, that's a critical hit. One shot." The lead Kroth vessel is losing atmosphere across 4 decks. On the bridge, nobody spoke for a moment. The Kroth fleet, which had spent 6 hours advancing with slow, patient confidence, suddenly broke formation, ships scattering in different directions as their sensors scrambled to understand what had just happened to one of their own. "They didn't expect that," Rel said quietly. "Look at them. They're not even trying to return fire yet. They're trying to figure out what hit them." The Valkyrie's Wrath did not give them time to figure it out. The ship moved in a way that made no sense to Seldara's understanding of naval combat, closing the distance to the fractured enemy formation, rather than holding back to fight at range the way any reasonable commander with a single ship against 41 would have done. It banked hard, weaving between the widening gaps in the Kroth line, and as it moved, it fired again and again, each shot finding a target with a precision that seemed almost impossible given the speed of the maneuver. "They're flying directly into the formation," Iona said, her voice climbing with disbelief. "Commander, that's suicidal. They're surrounded on every side." "They don't seem to think so," Seldara murmured, unable to look away from the display. A second Kroth ship staggered out of formation, trailing debris and venting atmosphere from a wound along its flank. A third took a hit to its engine section and began drifting, powerless, directly into the path of 2 more of its own vessels, forcing them to break formation to avoid a collision. The Valkyrie's Wrath moved through the chaos it was creating, like something that had planned for exactly this outcome from the very first shot, using the confusion of the enemy fleet as cover, striking, and moving before any single Kroth vessel could bring its full weapons to bear. "Their point defense weapons are firing," Doran reported. "They're finally trying to target the Valkyrie directly, but Commander, they're missing, repeatedly. Whatever that ship's evasive systems are, they're better than anything we have." Seldara watched the exchange with a growing sense of vertigo, the way a lifetime of assumptions about warfare, about what was possible and what was reckless, seemed to be unraveling in real time in front of her. She had trained her entire career under the belief that a single ship, however advanced, could not meaningfully alter the outcome of a battle against 41 opponents. She was watching that belief fail, ship by ship, in front of her own eyes. "Ket, hail the Valkyrie," Seldara said. "I want to know if they need support." Ket opened the channel immediately, and Captain Rhea's voice came through a moment later, still calm, though now edged with the focused intensity of a man in the middle of a fight he had clearly trained for his entire life. "Commander, hold your position. We've got their attention. Use this window to move civilian transports through the northern corridor while their formation's broken." Seldara turned immediately to her own tactical situation, momentarily pulled from the spectacle of the battle by the reminder of the actual purpose behind it. "Doran, execute. Move remaining evacuation shuttles through the northern corridor now, while the Kroth fleet is distracted." "Executing," Doran confirmed, already relaying the order. On the main display, the battle continued to unfold in ways that defied everything Seldara had expected. A 4th Kroth ship exploded outright, its reactor breached by a strike that had found some critical weakness in its design, the blast lighting up the darkness for a brief, violent moment before fading. The remaining Kroth vessels, finally recovering from their initial shock, began to organize, turning their combined firepower toward the single ship that had, in the span of a few short minutes, already crippled or destroyed 4 of their number. "They're converging on the Valkyrie," Iona said, urgency creeping into her voice. "Commander, that's 12 ships bringing weapons to bear on a single target." Seldara's chest tightened. For all the shock and awe of the last few minutes, this was the moment she had expected from the very beginning. The moment the numbers finally caught up with the single ship that had dared to challenge them. 12 Croth vessels, firing in concentrated volleys, was a weight of firepower that no single ship, however advanced, should have been able to survive. The Valkyrie's wrath did not attempt to survive it in the way Seldara expected. Instead of retreating, instead of trying to put distance between itself and the converging fire, the ship banked sharply and dove directly toward the heart of the Croth formation, closing the distance so quickly that several of the enemy vessels found themselves unable to fire without risking hitting their own ships. "They're using the enemy formation as cover," Doran said, understanding dawning in his voice. "They're too close for the Croth to use their heavier weapons without hitting each other." The Valkyrie's wrath tore through the heart of the Croth formation at close range, its weapons firing in every direction at once, each shot finding gaps in enemy shielding that Seldara couldn't begin to understand how a human targeting system could locate at such speed. 2 more Croth ships lost power to critical systems. A third took a hit that sent it spinning out of formation entirely, its crew clearly struggling to regain control. Through it all, the human ship's shields flickered under the strain of the fighting, visibly weakening with every exchange, but they held. The Valkyrie's wrath emerged from the heart of the enemy formation, battered but intact, already turning to bring its weapons to bear on its next target before the Croth fleet could fully regroup. "Status on the Valkyrie's shields?" Seldara asked. "Down to 60% and dropping," Ket reported. "They're taking damage, Commander. This isn't a fight they can sustain forever." Seldara understood the truth in that statement, even as she watched the human ship continue to fight with the same relentless intensity it had shown from the very first shot. One ship, however extraordinary, could not indefinitely hold off 41, or even the 35 that remained after the opening minutes of the engagement. Captain Reyes had said as much himself, back before the fighting began. He had come to buy time, to hurt the enemy, to change the shape of the battle long enough for something else to matter. "Commander," Doran said suddenly, a new note entering his voice, something between confusion and hope. "I'm reading new contacts. Multiple new contacts, entering the system from the same heading the Valkyrie arrived from." Seldara's head snapped toward the display, toward the new markers now appearing at the very edge of the sensor range, still too distant to identify clearly, but there, undeniably there, growing closer with every passing second. "How many?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Doran stared at his console for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, there was something in his voice that Seldara hadn't heard from anyone aboard the Hope in 6 long, desperate hours. Certainty. "A lot, Commander," he said. "I'm reading a lot." The new contacts were still too distant to identify clearly, but their number alone was enough to shift the mood on the bridge of the Starhome's Hope, from desperate hope to something closer to disbelief. "I'm counting at least 20 distinct signatures," Doran said, his hands moving quickly across his console as he tried to refine the readings. "Possibly more. They're moving fast, Commander, on the same heading the Valkyrie's wrath used to arrive." Seldara stared at the growing cluster of markers at the edge of the display, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. 3 hours ago, she had sent a distress call into empty space, with no real hope of a reply. Now not only had that call been answered, but the single ship that answered it had apparently been the opening move of something far larger. "Hail the Valkyrie again," she said. "I want an explanation." Ket opened the channel, and Captain Reyes's voice came through a moment later, still calm despite the sound of alarms audible faintly in the background of his own bridge, evidence of just how much strain his ship had endured in the last several minutes of fighting. "Commander, I imagine you're seeing what we're seeing." "I am," Seldara said. "Captain, you told me there was no fleet behind you. Was that a lie?" "It wasn't a lie," Reyes said. "It was the truth when I said it. Things change fast where we come from." "Explain," Seldara said, unable to keep the demand out of her voice. There was a brief pause, filled with the distant sound of another weapons exchange, before Reyes answered. When your distress call reached fringe space, it didn't just reach my ship. It reached a relay station we keep on the edge of our territory, close enough to pick up signals from outside our usual range. I was the closest combat vessel, so I moved first, alone, because waiting for a full response would have meant your station was already gone by the time help arrived. But I wasn't the only one who heard that call, Commander. I was just the fastest. Seldara felt something tighten in her chest, something that was not quite disbelief and not quite relief, but sat somewhere uncomfortably between the two. You sent one ship into a battle against 41, not knowing if more would follow. I sent one ship because somebody had to start buying time immediately, Reyes said. And for the first time, something harder entered his voice. Something that sounded less like a soldier following orders, and more like a man speaking from somewhere much older, and much more personal. Where I'm from, Commander, we don't wait for perfect information before we act. We've learned, the hard way, more than once, that hesitation costs lives that can't be gotten back. The hard way, Seldara repeated slowly. What does that mean, Captain? Another pause, longer this time. When Reyes spoke again, his voice had lost some of its calm and gained something rawer in its place. It means my people know exactly what it looks like when help doesn't come in time, Commander. It means we've been on the other side of a call like yours before, more than once in our own history, back when we were still fighting each other instead of standing together. We know what a besieged world sounds like when nobody answers. We decided a long time ago that when someone else's world sounds like that, we don't hesitate to answer, even if it means one ship going in alone while the rest of the fleet catches up. Seldara absorbed that for a moment, watching the tactical display where the reinforcing fleet continued its approach, closing the distance far faster than she would have believed possible only hours ago. She thought of the old academy lectures about humanity, the ones that had painted them as primitive, isolated, insular, a species content to remain confined to their own small solar system with little interest in the wider galaxy. Nothing about the ship fighting in front of her, or the fleet now closing in behind it, matched that description in the slightest. Your people, she said carefully. You mentioned fighting each other before you fought together. May I ask what changed? Reyes's answer came slower this time, weighted with something that sounded, even through translation, like old and well-worn grief. We nearly destroyed ourselves, Commander. More than once. We fought wars over land, over resources, over things that seem small now looking back. And every time, we told ourselves it was necessary, that the other side deserved whatever came to them. It took us a long time, and a lot of loss, to understand that the only thing those wars ever really cost us was each other. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had steadied again, settling back into the calm, practiced tone Seldara had heard from the very beginning. We're not perfect, Commander. We still argue, still disagree, still make mistakes. But somewhere along the way, we decided that when we saw someone else's world staring down the same kind of ending we almost gave ourselves, we wouldn't stand by and watch. Not if there was anything we could do about it. That's why my ship came alone, rather than wait. And that's why the rest of the fleet is coming now instead of days from now. Seldara looked out at the battle still raging beyond the Hope's hull, at the Valkyrie's wrath still weaving between the remaining Croth vessels, its shields flickering but holding, buying every last second it could until the reinforcements arrived. She thought of her own people's history, of the quiet, comfortable peace they had built for themselves far from the galaxy's larger conflicts, a peace that had left them utterly unprepared for a threat like the Croth Empire when it finally arrived at their door. Captain, she said slowly, may I ask why the Croth? Specifically, you could have simply sent your reinforcements without engaging yourself. Why put your own ship in the heart of that formation? The pause this time was the longest yet, and when Reyes finally answered, there was an edge in his voice that Seldara hadn't heard before, something cold and controlled, the sound of a man holding back something much larger than the words he chose to say. Because I've read the Croth Empire's file, Commander, he said. Slavers, forced labor camps, entire populations stripped from their homes and worked to death on some forge world nobody ever hears from again. My people have a very specific, very personal history with exactly that kind of empire, back before we learned better. I don't extend the same patience to slavers that I extend to most enemies. When I saw what they were doing to your people, I wasn't interested in waiting for the rest of the fleet to catch up before I did something about it." Seldara said nothing for a long moment, watching the battle continue on the main display, watching the reinforcing human fleet close the last of the distance toward the system. She thought about everything she had assumed about the galaxy over the course of her career, about which species mattered and which didn't, about who could be relied upon in a crisis and who could not. Every one of those assumptions had been quietly, thoroughly dismantled over the last several hours by a species her own people had once dismissed as primitive and unimportant. "Captain Reyes," she said finally, "on behalf of my people, whatever happens in the next hour, thank you for answering a call you had no obligation to answer." The burrito was cold. "Every obligation started somewhere, Commander," Reyes said, and for the first time, something almost like warmth crept into his voice. "Ours started the day we decided nobody should have to face something like this alone. Now, if you don't mind, I've got a battle to keep winning until my friends get here." The channel closed, and Seldara turned back to the tactical display, watching the growing cluster of reinforcing ships close the last of the distance toward the besieged system, watching the Kroth fleet, already battered and disorganized, begin to realize exactly what kind of enemy they had truly provoked. "Doran," she said quietly. "Time until the reinforcing fleet arrives?" Doran checked his console, and when he looked up, there was something in his expression that Seldara hadn't seen on the bridge of the Starhome's Hope in 6 long hours, something that looked almost like certainty that they were going to survive this after all. 12 minutes, Commander," he said. 12 minutes, and then we'll find out exactly how badly the Kroth Empire underestimated us." The 12 minutes that followed felt, to Seldara, both endless and impossibly short. The Valkyrie's Wrath continued its solitary fight against the remaining Kroth vessels, its shields now flickering dangerously low, its weapons systems visibly straining under the sustained demand of the engagement. Seldara watched the ship take a direct hit to its port side, watched it stagger for a brief, terrifying moment, before righting itself and returning fire with no less intensity than before. Whatever the human ship's crew was enduring aboard that battered hull, they showed no sign of slowing down. "Shields at 30%, Ket reported, her voice tight with concern. "Commander, they can't take much more of this." "They know that better than we do," Seldara said, though the words did nothing to ease the tightness in her own chest. "Doran, time until reinforcements arrive?" 8 minutes, Doran said. "Commander, the Kroth fleet is beginning to notice the new contacts on their own sensors. They're breaking off some of their ships to investigate." On the main display, Seldara watched several of the remaining Kroth vessels peel away from their engagement with the Valkyrie's Wrath, turning to face the growing cluster of new contacts now visible at the edge of the system. For the first time since the battle began, something that looked almost like hesitation rippled through the Kroth formation, ships slowing their advance, as their commanders tried to assess a threat they had no data to properly evaluate. "They're afraid," Rel said quietly, watching the same display. "Look at them. They don't know what's coming, and it's making them cautious." "They should be afraid," Seldara said. "So was I, 3 hours ago, when I didn't know what was coming either." The reinforcing human fleet grew closer with every passing minute, and as it did, Seldara finally began to make out details her sensors had struggled to resolve before. The ships were not identical to the Valkyrie's Wrath, but they shared the same aggressive, angular design language, the same dark, armored hulls built for a single purpose. Some were smaller, faster vessels that reminded her of the Valkyrie itself. Others were larger, heavier ships that dwarfed even the Kroth capital vessels, bristling with weapons emplacements along every visible surface. "I'm counting 26 ships," Doran said, his voice climbing with something between disbelief and awe. "Commander, 2 of those contacts are enormous, larger than anything in the Kroth fleet. Captain Reyes said his people don't hesitate when someone else's world is at stake," Seldara murmured, watching the approaching fleet with growing wonder. I don't think he was exaggerating. The Kroth fleet, already fractured and disorganized from the Valkyrie's Wrath's relentless assault, now faced an impossible decision. 26 additional human warships, still minutes from arrival, closing fast, while the single ship they had already spent the better part of an hour failing to destroy continued fighting, with undiminished ferocity in their midst. Commander, Iona said suddenly, I'm reading a change in the Croth fleet's formation. They're consolidating, pulling back from their forward positions. They're considering retreat, Seldara said, watching the enemy formation shift on the display. Can they retreat fast enough? Rel asked. The answer came a few minutes later, when the reinforcing human fleet finally crossed into weapons range of the outermost Croth vessels. Seldara watched, transfixed, as the two largest human ships opened fire simultaneously, their weapons striking with a force that made the Valkyrie's Wrath's earlier attacks look almost gentle by comparison. A Croth capital ship, one of the largest in their entire fleet, took a direct hit across its central hull and simply came apart, its structure unable to withstand the force of the strike, debris scattering across the void where a moment before a warship had been. The bridge of the Starhome's Hope fell utterly silent. That was their flagship, Doran said quietly, staring at the wreckage on the display. Commander, that was their fleet flagship, and it's gone. The remaining Croth vessels, already reeling from the loss of their command ship, broke formation entirely, scattering in every direction as the human fleet pressed its advantage, weapons fire lighting up the void in patterns Seldara had never imagined a battle could take. The Valkyrie's Wrath, seizing the opportunity created by the chaos, turned its attention to the ships attempting to flee, cutting off their retreat routes, with a precision that suggested its crew had been waiting for exactly this moment. They're not letting them run, Ket said, watching the tactical display with wide eyes. Would you? Seldara asked quietly. After everything those ships were prepared to do to our people. Within minutes, what remained of the Croth fleet had been reduced to a scattering of damaged, fleeing vessels, pursued relentlessly by a human fleet that showed no sign of easing its assault. Seldara watched 3 more Croth ships destroyed outright, their crews given no opportunity to surrender, while a handful of others managed to break away entirely, fleeing toward the edge of the system at whatever speed their damaged engines could still provide. Should we pursue? Doran asked, looking to Seldara for orders, though the question felt almost unnecessary given the state of her own battered, exhausted fleet. No, Seldara said. Our people have suffered enough today. Let the humans finish what they started. Focus everything we have left on the surface. I want status reports on every shelter, every evacuation route, every family that spent the last 6 hours waiting to find out if they'd survive the night. The orders went out, and slowly, the mood on the bridge began to shift from stunned disbelief to something that resembled, tentatively, relief. Seldara watched the last of the fleeing Croth vessels disappear from her sensors, pursued by 2 smaller human ships that had broken off from the main engagement, while the bulk of the human fleet began to regroup near the Valkyrie's Wrath, whose shields had finally dropped low enough to trigger automatic emergency protocols visible even from the Hope's own sensors. Hail the Valkyrie, Seldara said. I want to know their status. Ket opened the channel, and after a brief delay, a different voice answered, younger than Reyes's own, carrying a note of exhaustion mixed with something like pride. Starhome's Hope, this is the Valkyrie's Wrath. Captain Reyes is currently receiving medical attention, but he asked me to relay a message before he did. Go ahead, Seldara said, her chest tightening with sudden concern. He wanted you to know the Croth fleet has been broken. Confirmed kills on 19 vessels, with the remainder either destroyed by pursuing units or scattered beyond effective recovery. Your station and your surface population are no longer under threat. Seldara closed her eyes for a brief moment, feeling 6 hours of accumulated tension finally begin to release from her shoulders. Around her, the bridge crew of the Starhome's Hope allowed themselves, for the first time since the crisis began, small, tentative expressions of relief. Ket's hands trembled slightly as she kept the channel open. Doran let out a long breath he had clearly been holding for longer than he realized. Even Rel, standing near the back of the bridge, allowed his shoulders to drop from the rigid, anxious posture he had held for the entire engagement. Is Captain Reyes going to be all right? Seldara asked. He'll recover, Commander, the voice replied. Took some damage when we breached their formation the second time, but nothing our medical bay can't handle. He wanted me to add one more thing, if you don't mind me relaying it exactly as he said it. Please, Seldara said. He said, tell the commander the void isn't always empty. Sometimes it just takes the right kind of ship to prove it. Seldara found herself, despite everything, despite 6 hours of fear and desperation and near certain loss, smiling, for the first time since the crisis had begun. She looked around her bridge, at her exhausted but relieved crew, at the tactical display now showing a system, finally, blessedly clear of enemy threats, and allowed herself to believe, fully and completely, that her people had survived the night. "Tell Captain Reyes," she said, "that when he's recovered, the commander would very much like to meet the crew who proved it." Burrito. 3 days after the battle, the docking bay of the Star Home's Hope had been cleared and cleaned, in preparation for a meeting Seldara had never expected to have. She stood near the airlock, connecting her ship to a small human shuttle that had detached from the Valkyrie's Wrath an hour earlier, watching the display above the door count down the final minutes before it opened. Behind her, a small honor guard of Valen officers stood at careful attention, and beside her, Rel shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly as nervous about this meeting as she was, though neither of them had said so out loud. In the days since the battle, the system had slowly returned to something resembling normal life. Evacuation shelters had emptied, as families returned to homes that, against every expectation from 6 hours before, were still standing. Repair crews had begun the long work of restoring Illyra Station's damaged sections. The human fleet had remained in the system throughout, assisting with search and rescue operations among the wreckage of the Croth ships, recovering what they could and destroying the rest, careful and thorough, in a way that suggested long practice with the aftermath of exactly this kind of battle. Seldara had spoken with Captain Reyes several more times over those 3 days, brief exchanges mostly focused on coordination and logistics, but she had not yet met him in person. That was about to change. The airlock hissed open, and Seldara found herself looking, for the first time, at an actual human being, rather than a voice on a comm channel, or a ship on a tactical display. Captain Marcus Reyes was shorter than she had somehow expected, though still tall for what she understood of human proportions, with dark hair beginning to show streaks of gray, and a face lined in ways that suggested a career spent making difficult decisions under difficult circumstances. A bandage was visible along one side of his jaw, evidence of the injury his crew had mentioned during the battle, though he moved without any sign that it troubled him. He wore a simple, dark uniform, devoid of the elaborate decorations Seldara might have expected from someone commanding a warship capable of what she had witnessed 3 days earlier. He stopped a respectful distance away and offered a small nod of his head, a gesture Seldara's translation earpiece identified as a common human sign of greeting and respect. "Commander Voth," he said, his voice matching the one she had come to know over the last several days, though hearing it in person, without the distortion of a comm channel, felt strangely more real than everything that had come before. "It's good to finally meet you properly." "Captain Reyes," Seldara replied, stepping forward and extending her hand in the Valen gesture of welcome, a custom she had briefed him on through an intermediary the day before. Reyes took her hand carefully, mimicking the gesture with the slight awkwardness of someone performing an unfamiliar custom with genuine care rather than casual disregard. "On behalf of my entire fleet, and every person on the surface of Vertha who is alive today because of your actions, thank you. There are no words in my language sufficient to express what your people did for us." "You don't need elaborate words, Commander," Reyes said, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "You already gave us the only thing we needed. You called, we came. That's the whole of it, as far as I'm concerned." Seldara studied him for a moment, thinking of everything she had learned over the last 3 days, not just about this one ship and its remarkable crew, but about the wider human fleet that had answered a call from a species they had never even met, from a corner of the galaxy their own scholars apparently knew almost nothing about. She thought about the old lectures from her academy days, about the dismissive rumors of a primitive, isolated species, confined to their own small solar system, rumors that could not have been more wrong. "Captain," she said, "may I ask you something directly?" "Of course." "Why?" she asked. "Not the tactical reasons. Not the history you shared during the battle. I understand those. I mean truly, why does your species do this? You risked your life, and the lives of your crew, for people you had never met. From a region of space, your fleet apparently doesn't even regularly patrol. What does your civilization gain from an act like that?" Reyes considered the question for a long moment, his eyes drifting briefly toward the viewport at the edge of the docking bay, where the stars of the Alira system were visible beyond the hull. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of someone who had thought about this question many times before, likely long before Seldara had ever asked it. "Gain isn't really the right word for it, Commander," he said. "We don't do this because it profits us, at least not in any way that shows up on a ledger. We do it because a long time ago, back when we were still fighting each other more than anyone else, we learned what it costs a species to look away from someone else's suffering. It costs you something you don't always notice you've lost, right up until you need someone to look back at you, and you realize you taught the whole galaxy that looking away was acceptable." He paused, glancing back at her, his expression steady and sincere. "So we decided, as a species, a long time ago, that we'd rather be the kind of civilization that answers, even when it's costly, even when it's just one ship against 41, than the kind that waits for someone else to go first. It's not perfect, we don't always get there in time. But we try, every time, because the alternative is becoming exactly the kind of galaxy that let the Kroth Empire believe nobody would ever come for you." Seldara felt something shift quietly inside her chest, a feeling she suspected would take her a long time to fully understand. For 300 years, her people had built their peaceful, comfortable civilization far from the galaxy's larger conflicts, confident that isolation was its own form of safety. The events of the last week had shattered that confidence entirely, replacing it with something far more complicated. A galaxy where danger could arrive without warning, but also, she now understood, a galaxy where help could arrive from directions no one had ever thought to look. "My people have spent 300 years believing we didn't need alliances beyond our immediate neighbors," Seldara said slowly. "We believed that keeping to ourselves kept us safe. I think, Captain, that we were wrong." "Every civilization learns that lesson eventually, Commander," Reyes said gently. "Better to learn it from a rescue than from a grave. You got the easier version of that lesson. Trust me, my people didn't." Seldara nodded slowly, looking past him toward the viewport, toward the human fleet still visible in the distance, ships that had arrived from a region of space her people had once dismissed as unworthy of serious study, a region that had turned out to hold a civilization more capable and more willing to help than any of the established powers who had refused her call 3 days before. "Captain Reyes," she said, "I would like to formally propose the beginning of diplomatic relations between the Valen Concord and your government. Not simply out of gratitude, though that gratitude is real and will not be forgotten. I believe there is a great deal my people could learn from yours, and perhaps, in time, a great deal we could offer in return." Reyes smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his tired eyes in a way that made him look, for a brief moment, less like a battle-hardened warship captain and more like a man simply glad to have made a new friend. "I'd like that very much, Commander. I imagine my government will feel the same. For what it's worth, this is usually how it starts." One ship, one call answered, and a whole galaxy finding out humanity was closer than they thought. Seldara looked out at the stars beyond the viewport, at the quiet, ordinary void that had, only days before, felt like the emptiest and most hopeless place imaginable. She thought of the moment she had sent that final distress call, certain it would go unanswered. One small voice, thrown into darkness, with no real expectation of a reply. She understood now that the void had never truly been empty. It had simply been waiting for someone brave enough, and stubborn enough, to answer. "Welcome to the wider galaxy, Captain Reyes," she said quietly. "I have a feeling it's about to become a great deal more interesting, now that everyone else finds out exactly who was listening all along." Behind her, the human fleet held its quiet vigil over a system it had saved, and far beyond the edges of both their territories, word of what had happened at Alira Station was only just beginning to spread.